Hello and welcome to today's webinar on SERDP Funding Opportunities. My name is Laura Mack and I will be moderating today's session. We will get started in just a few moments. While we wait for others to join, I would like to cover a few logistical items. Today's broadcast will be listen only. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. You may submit questions by using the Q&A box on the black control panel on your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit them in advance of that session. The phone lines will remain listen only throughout the presentation, so we will not be taking any questions verbally. We will not be able to answer questions about specific proposal ideas or technologies during this webinar. If you run into any technical problems, please send your issues through the chat box, which is also found on your control panel. Please note that both the audio and the presentation of today's session will be archived on our solicitation webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. Today's speakers are Dr. Herb Nelson, the Executive Director of SERDP, Dr. Andrea Leeson, the Deputy Director of SERDP and the Environmental Restoration Program Manager, Dr. Robin Nissan, the Weapons Systems and Platforms Program Manager, Dr. Kurt Preston, the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program Manager, and Dr. Dave Bradley, the Munitions Response Program Manager. Before I turn it over to Herb, I would like to remind you that this is a listen-only session, and to submit questions, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Off to you, Herb.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome to you all. I hope that this will turn out to be valuable and you'll get some information that will help you prepare a proposal or prepare your proposal and point it at the right spot. The way we run this session in general, and what we're going to try to do today, is I give some introductory remarks, run over the program, make sure everybody knows where we are and what we are, talk a little bit about how to submit a proposal, and then we turn it over to each of the program managers in turn who run through the statements of need that we released a week and a half ago for each of the program areas. And then we go to questions. So as Laura said, as you think about questions, please just type them into the box now. We've got a running list of them and we'll answer them as we get to them at the end of the talk. So next slide, please, Laura. So this is just to remind you that we are really two companion programs. All of you are here today to hear about SERDP, the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, which is a science and technology program. But we also have a companion program in the same office named the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. And that is what ESTCP calls a demonstration validation program, or some of you would know it as 6-4 program, where we take technologies developed by SERDP or developed in other places, no requirement for SERDP, and take them to a real field demonstration under real field conditions and see how they work. But of course, today the focus is on SERDP. So next slide, please, Laura. So I've said the name several times. This is a program that was established by Congress in the early 90s. It's a partnership among the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. And we are, in DoD words, a 6-3 program element. That probably doesn't mean a lot to many of you, but what that means is we are able to support research from basic research to what the DoD calls advanced development. And I often define advanced development as a pilot study in the backyard, or maybe if you're at a university, something at the university research park. That level of work is all appropriate for SERDP. And the charter of SERDP is to work on DoD and DOE priority environmental issues. We also try to focus on things that have the largest cost to DoD so we can get the biggest bang for our buck. Next slide, please. So just to let you know, this really echoes what I talked about in the last two slides. This is really how the Department of Defense manages all technology development. We gather requirements from the services. We're obviously in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, so we're over all the services. Gather the environmental requirements from the services. We support both basic and applied research and advanced development in SERDP, and then we hand that off to ESTCP that does demonstration validation, with the goal, of course, being the box on the far right, implementation. Next slide, please. So several things drive our work, and I think that you will see almost all of these reflected in the statements of need as you look them over at on our website. First, of course, is installation resilience, sustainment of our ranges, management of threatened and endangered species responsibilities on our installations. Next slide, please. And then the second aspect of our program is to develop technologies to help work on the cleanup of contamination for past practices, both the environmental restoration. I'll introduce you to these program areas in a slide, the next slide, but both our environmental restoration and munitions response program areas develop technologies to be used by the Defense Environmental Restoration Program. And then we also, the second half of that is, of course, to not make future SERDP have to develop these technologies. So try to control new contamination currently. Next slide, please. So I just prefigured that I would talk to you about our program management structure. We divide ourselves administratively into 4 program areas. On the top right is environmental restoration, which is sort of traditional chemical cleanup issues, working on both things that were around in the 70s as well as emerging contaminants such as PFAS. Bottom right is munitions response, which, as the picture indicates here, is focusing almost entirely on munitions, unexploded ordnance in the underwater environment. On the bottom left is resource conservation and resiliency, which sort of has a dual focus, and you'll see that in the statements of need. Developing technologies to help installation natural resources managers manage the natural infrastructure on the installations, take care of their threatened and endangered species responsibilities, but also work to increase the resiliency of the built infrastructure on our DoD installations. And then finally, in the top left, the weapon systems and platforms, which is all things defense industrial based, developing technologies to make processes better and safer at DoD depots and maintenance facilities, sustainable energetics, things along that line. So this isn't real important other than we published the statements of need, which we're going to get to later in this talk, by program area. And we bring in experts from the services in each of these program areas to help us decide. So you'll definitely want to figure out where you fit. And that, of course, will come many times from just reading through the titles and then the substance of the statements of need. Next slide, please. So I made reference just in the last slide about our technical committees. We have technical committees for each of the 4 program areas. They're made up of representatives from the services, as well as our partner agencies, DOE and EPA. And I've already told you a couple, 3 slides ago that we get requirements up from the customers through these technical committees. But the technical committees are far more than that. They help us craft the statements of need. They help us rank order and make decisions on the solicitations, which proposals to fund. And then when we have funded projects and they're ongoing, they help us manage those ongoing projects. So it's really no exaggeration to say that the technical committees are in the center of everything that goes on at SERDP. And what's not really shown on this slide is the final role that they play when we have successes and we want to get the technologies out to the other components of DoD. They're our conduit back out. Next slide, please. So we have 2 types of solicitations. If you've been to the website and started looking at the statements of need, you'll already know this. We have so-called core statements of need. We talk about SONs here, so you probably hear me say SON several times. We expect always to have multiple awards per SON, so it's not as if there's one grand winner. We'd like to put together a team of investigators working toward a goal. We have both multi-year proposals, which would be our traditional, what we would call traditional core proposal. There's also an option for a limited scope proposal under these core statements of need, and that would be approximately 1-year effort, $250,000 funding, and that would be appropriate in a case where there's a good idea, but you might not have enough data to fairly price or to lay out the milestones for a full 3-year proposal or 2-year proposal, whatever is appropriate. So you would need to gather some data to get a chance to fairly put together a traditional proposal. These are released as a broad agency announcement for people in universities, industries, and as a federal call for proposal for other federal agencies and DoD. We also have a program called the SERDP Exploratory Development, or SEED. This year, only Munitions Response has offered a SEED statement of need. This is the same sort of timescale and funding as a limited scope, but the difference is these are really meant to be high risk, high payoff work. one difference you'll see shortly in the process for these is the seed proposals do not go out to peer review. The thinking that peer review biases against really high risk ideas, and we want to fail a lot in seeds so that when we succeed, it's a big success. Next slide, please. So I'll walk you through the traditional process, our process. Go ahead, click please. So we've talked already, we develop our statements of need based on feedback from the services, based on workshops that we've done over the years, based on things we've seen at scientific meetings. That went on through August and September of the year. Next click, please. Then we, in late October, and this year was just a week and a half ago, we published the broad agency announcement and the federal call for proposals. Click please, Laura. Those two both solicit for pre-proposals. We at SERDP do a pre-proposal then full proposal process. We find this works the best. You only have to spend a little time, 5 pages on the pre-proposal to get your idea exposed to the committee. You don't have to do a lot of work if you're not pointing in the way we want to go. We don't have to read a lot if you're not pointing in the way we want to go. Next click, please. That is all taken care of by the SERDP staff and members of the SERDP technical committees. Excuse me. Next click. So then, based on the pre-proposals, we invite full proposals from a subset of those. That invitations will go out in early March. Click, please. When full proposals come back in, they then go to peer review. So it's a 2-step selection process. Peer review for scientific merit. Next click, please. Those that pass peer review, and I would say, upwards of 80% get an acceptable peer review scores. Then those go on to the SERDP technical committees again, and that's where the DoD relevance comes into play. So it's both, the proposals have to be both have high scientific merit, but also be relevant to a DoD problem. We are a mission-oriented agency. Next click, please, Laura. Selections are then made over the summer, and maybe 2 clicks. Oh, sorry, I fibbed, it's only 1 click. And then we go on to approval by our scientific advisory board, and then contracts can be awarded. Next click, please, now. So here are the actual dates in this go around that go with all those things I said. I gave you the round number dates. You can see when pre-proposals are due, we get out the call, we get out the request for full proposals, we shoot for as much time as possible. We try to give you 6 weeks to develop your full proposal, and then that lays out the rest of it. And much more of this can be found on our website. The URLs at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please, Laura. And then the seeds, as I told you, are slightly delayed because they don't have the peer review step. So full proposals for seeds are due in March, the same time that full proposals of SERDP will be done, and then the rest is in parallel. Next slide. So this is, of course, a question that always comes up, so I just answer it right here. What are your success rates? You can see last year's rates for all the various possibilities. In round numbers, 1 in 3 pre-proposal is invited to submit a full proposal, and 1 in 3 full proposals are funded. That's how you get to something like a third and something like a ninth. It's actually slightly higher than a ninth pre-proposal selection. I'd like these to be a little bit higher, but there are a lot of good proposals submitted and a finite budget, so this is where they turn out to be. And this has been stable for some years, so I think if we had mistakenly put the FY21 numbers up here, you wouldn't know it. Next slide, please. So these are the selection criteria, and we say this in the instructions for submitting a proposal, but I just want to go over them a little bit. I think they ought to be obvious to you. It's the things we ought to be asking if we're putting together a science program. Of course, the first step, and it's a pass-fail gate, is does this address the statement of need? I think you will find as you look at these statements of need that some of them are very narrowly crafted, and that's because there's a specific problem that we're trying to solve. So I think it's good advice that if you're trying to stretch yourself to fit the statement of need objective, that's not a particularly good use of your time because it will probably fail the relevance gate. Of course, we only want to support things that are from basic research to advanced technology. If this is a commercial product, it's not likely to be appropriate for SERDP. After we get past that gate, then we do the normal proposal things. Is this of high technical merit? Has the PI put together a team with the right qualifications, the right backgrounds to address the problem you're trying to solve? Is the cost reasonable for the technical complexity that you propose? We're not particularly cost sensitive, but we definitely want the cost proposed to line up with the task so that we're paying for what we want to get. And then finally, when we get the full proposal, we want to see a plan. We want to see how this can go on to solve a DoD problem. That's definitely the more basic the proposal, the less that comes into play, the more closer to implementation, the more that comes into play. Next slide, please. And seed selection criteria are similar. Obviously, technical merit is the biggest one. Relevance issue, is this actually a high risk, high payoff issue or not? And then transition potential is the same for seed, although since these are high risk, high payoff situations, that may not be as clearly a straight line path the DoD needs. Next slide, please. And then these probably should not surprise anyone on this presentation. If you've spent some of your scientific career writing proposals, here really are what makes a competitive proposal to SERDP. And I've said a lot of these things already. Step number one, you clearly address the statement of need. Some of them, as I said to you earlier, are very tightly focused because we've got a specific problem in mind. Some of them are broader and are asking for technologies in a general area. So depending on which those is, make sure you address the statement of need. Clearly, you have to demonstrate both to us and to the peer reviewers that you understand the state of the science in the area you're proposing in. We also want hypothesis-driven work. We want you to propose questions, unknowns, and then lay out a course to solve those unknowns. And then you will certainly want to, in both your pre-proposal, but in a larger extent when you have many more pages available in the full proposal, to focus on the technical approach. Make sure the people that are reading your proposal and making the judgments on it can understand what you're trying to do, can understand your experimental design. Because when people are confused, and I'm sure you've done this yourself in either paper reviews or proposal reviews, when people are confused, they tend not to give things a very good score. So make sure that people can understand what you want to do. Okay, with that, that's my overview. We're going to hand it over now to the program managers in turn. We do this alphabetically, so Robin Neeson always loses. So we'll start with Andrea Leeson in environmental restoration.
Great, thank you, Herb. So as Herb said, we're each of the program managers will describe their statement of needs. And before I get started with that, I did want to let you know that with the statements of need that are posted, each one shows you the contact information for that particular statement of need, or the program manager who can answer the questions you may have about that particular statement of need. We're going to do that today as well, but if questions occur to you later, please feel free to reach out to the person who's listed in that statement of need. Next slide, Laura. And the next slide. So first we'll cover the environmental restoration program area. And we have 4 statements of need that were released under that program area this year. The first 2 I wanted to talk about is related to PFAS. As you may know, we have a large program devoted to the impact of PFAS in the environment, and we have a number of projects that are a number of initiatives that are looking at developing new treatment technologies, looking at fate and transport, ecotoxicity, as well as sampling and analysis. This first statement of need is really focused on a better understanding of what is going on with the precursor in really these source zone sort of areas. And so you can see the 3 different sub-objectives that are listed here, that it is about understanding the fate and transport of these sorts of chemicals, as well as understanding those relevant environmental factors that could impact the transformation rates of these chemicals. And then we're also looking to develop methodologies or molecular biological tools that help us assess the rate of in situ transformation under field conditions for these chemicals. You can see listed below here the link to our PFAS efforts. This link just gives you an overview of what we have funded in the past on PFAS, if you'd like to get some understanding of what's going on in the program with PFAS. Next slide. So the next slide, the next topic on PFAS that we're looking at is to get a better handle on addressing PFAS that has impacted concrete and asphalt through historical releases of AFFF. And that can be in a couple of ways, and as far as understanding the leaching potential of PFAS from these materials, as well as the magnitude of the loading to the environment from these materials, and then also developing technologies for managing impacted concrete and asphalt in place. I also wanted to mention, the link is not shown here, but I have put it in the chat, and you can also find it in the Statement of Need, that there is a recent method that was released, the EPA Draft Method 1633, released this past August. Please be familiar with these techniques listed. They will provide the new new analytical methodologies for analyzing PFAS in a variety of different matrices, so please be familiar with that. We are requiring that method to be used for future projects on PFAS. Next slide. We also have a statement of need that is dealing with stormwater impacts of DoD facilities. Very specifically, we want to improve our management of stormwater at our installations, particularly stormwater that is impacted by PFAS. And again, the method that I just released will be directly relevant to any studies that are going on stormwater with PFAS. We're looking at different active treatment technologies and how they can handle varying flows, as well as complex stormwater mixtures. We want to see about developing better passive treatment technologies, and then also looking at assessing and determining how to determine the background PFAS concentrations in these discharge waters. Next slide. And then the last ERSON is dealing with the attenuation of other components of groundwater contaminant mixtures. And these are typically the sorts of chemicals that co-occur with our chlorinated solvent plumes. Very specifically is 1,4-dioxane, that's of the greatest interest, but others include 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane. And there is more information in the Statement of Need in terms of what we've been seeing with these chemicals at the DoD installations. Particularly, we want to understand some of the natural attenuation mechanisms and degradation kinetics of these chemical concerns. And particularly that part of the issue with this is that when we install our common groundwater treatment options for chlorinated solvents, these relatively minor components are possibly not being treated to the extent that we need them to be. And we're interested in looking at whether minor modifications can be made to these traditional groundwater treatment technologies that would allow us to also treat these co-occurring chemicals. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David Bradley to introduce the Statements of Need in the Munitions Response Program. David?
Thanks, Andrea. And hello, everyone, on the eve of Armistice Day. As Herb indicated earlier, munition response is in the marine environment. Next slide, Laura, please. The dynamics and spatial variation of that world require all sensing modalities to be considered. We're looking at optical, electromagnetic, acoustic, and other signature producing systems. And they're all on the table for detection, localization, and classification of what we often call UXOs, or unexploded ordnance. We interchange that word with munitions from time to time. We're getting close to identification. Just a moment ago, I used the term classification, which more generally would distinguish large from small targets. Identification in this context would be something like a 155 millimeter howitzer round or scrap metal. For identification, We're looking for analysis methods such as machine learning, which are required to deal with the complexity of target responses, measurement uncertainties in the marine environment, and environmental variation. In addition, at the scales we're looking at, munition conditions have to be understood, and this requires marine growth behavior and metallurgical status information. Our world is one of dealing with depths from the beach to max recreational diving, which is of order 30 meters. Add in busy harbors, pilings, moorings, and recognize the challenge to assemble a variety of sensor suites and host platforms that would be required for efficient and effective operations. Finally, dredging and man-in-the-loop recovery and disposal is both too costly and dangerous. If the cost is too much, we manage in place. Manage in place is a bureaucratic way to say do nothing. We, of course, don't do nothing. What we do is develop an understanding of munition burial and mobility during dynamic events such as hurricanes. I'm going to end this with a plea that we are desperately looking for solutions to this problem. And now I'll introduce Dr. Kurt Preston. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Kurt Preston. I'm the Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resiliency. Next slide, please. So we have two calls for proposals or statements of need this year. The first one is advancing understanding methods for invasive species. And so these proposals or the projects are sought to focus on innovative methods that address invasive species currently present or with a high likelihood of becoming established on Department of Defense lands. The proposals must consider climate change induced effects, changes in invasive species abundance and distribution, and resultant impacts. The impact of non-indigenous invasive species on military operations is fourfold. Invasive species may possess physical characteristics that can directly limit training activity. The expansion of invasive species populations can negate realistic training and testing operations and lead to habitat destruction. And invasive species and biosecurity measures are required to control the species, and the species themselves can hinder strategic mobility. And finally, the operations to detect and control invasive species themselves, just the time and effort, can detract from other mission activities. When you take a look at the statement of need, you will see a list of species that are particularly relevant to DoD. And of course, the question arises, is this list all-inclusive? And the answer is it's not. And even if you are putting together a proposal that addresses one of those species in particular, it still is up to the proposer to make the argument of why that species is particularly important. The following should be considered in developing your proposals. The use of existing or novel techniques, with preference being given to varied and integrated assessment approaches. Proposals that address the analysis of potential climate change and the impacts thereof. And then proposals that address invasive species that have a high likely impact for both the Department of Defense and more broadly for the country. Thank you very much. That's the first statement of need. Now, next slide, please. So the second statement of need is in the area of innovative approaches for resolving sea level related data and datum gaps. And the objective of this SON is research that will enhance DoD's Defense Regional Sea Level Rise database. And I will say, if you're unfamiliar with that database, the database is available to the public. And the key point here is that the Department of Defense has a large number of coastal and tidally influenced sites worldwide. And the availability and quality of information is highly variable across the globe. For globally distributed entities such as the Department of Defense, that variation hampers our planning for and responses to impacts on coastal and tidally influenced assets. Authoritative geodetic datums generally are available in the continental United States. However, significant data gaps exist outside CONUS. And even for some CONUS, and when I say CONUS, I mean continental United States sites. So generating data and datum relationships and water level information for sites lacking such information on a site-by-site basis is very intensive, resource intensive. And so we're looking for more efficient and spatially dispersed approaches for covering multiple sites at a time. The research efforts that are sought, again, are to look at more efficient and effective data collection methods for establishing robust estimates of mean sea level rise for DoD sites, principally outside the continental United States. And we're looking for spatially extending the applicability of these efforts for distances outside the United States and for data collection, and establishing confidence bounds for information as a function of distance. For sites possessing complex coastal geomorphology, such as embayments and estuaries, the development of rigorous approaches for estimating mean high water and mean higher high water is, in a spatially explicit manner, is sought. And so that gives you the background information. I invite you to, for both these statements of need, come down to our website and look at them in detail. That's all I have, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Robin Neeson.
Thank you, Kurt. So weapon systems and platforms area. In this area, we have 6 statements of need. And the first one is revolves around hydrofluorocarbons. So HFCs were the choice when CFCs were eliminated many years ago. And now we're looking at situations where these HFCs are not as available, and we're having issues with the potential for acquiring some of these materials. And there are specific areas where the DoD has requirements for refrigeration, and we're looking for alternatives. Those alternatives might be chemical alternatives, they might be technical alternatives. The bottom line is there are several of these HFC 134, HFC 23, which are of particular need, and I would say that it's not just chemical alternatives, but technological alternatives. The difference between what the military requirements for refrigerants are and the commercial world really revolve around the military environment. The fact that you know, we get shot at, and there are issues of potential for fires, and so a lot of the refrigerants that we use also need to be resistant to fire. So that's this topic. Next one, please. We have a couple of statements of need on PFAS-free firefighting formulations and testing of. This one's on new formulations and the testing of those formulations to ensure that they can work under conditions that the DoD requires them to work. So salt and freshwater, low and high temperature operation, and we also are very interested in coming up with alternatives that are Newtonian or low viscosity, because they should then be able to be drop-in replacements. And of course, performance is a key here, and we want them to perform as well as some of the commercial materials that are out there right now that are also PFAS free. Next one, please. So advanced military coating systems. We're looking here for innovative top coats and stack ups for military equipment. And the main issue, of course, is to eliminate some of those toxic and hazardous materials that are used in top coats. And we understand that there are still some that are currently out there that don't have, let's say, a good life cycle characteristics, meaning that over time we may not be able to sustain them, to change them out, to find good ways of stripping and recoating some of our military assets. So all of these areas are, what we require is a top coat system that is less complex, is scalable, can be stripped easily, and of course does not contain any of those toxic materials that we're trying to eliminate. And several of those are called out in the full statement of need. Next, please. We have, over the past several years, been looking at many additive methodologies for repairing and building back structural materials. And what we're looking at in this particular case is a methodology for producing powders that can be reusing and recycling and making powders from materials that are scrapped. So the goal here is to not only find a good methodology for taking these refractory alloys, and noted here are tantalum, niobium, molybdenum, vanadium, tungsten, rhenium. I'd say, people are going to ask, is that all inclusive? And the answer is probably not. You might find that cobalt is also of concern here. The specific issues related to those powders is not just can we produce powders, but can we make them into materials that are then useful, that meet the requirements of the original. So that's where the mechanical properties, the internal defects, the porosity of the builds that are made with these powders comes into play. Okay, next. So now we get to a statement of need that is looking at fire testing and testing methodologies. Currently, what goes on a lot is we take a look. We either a burn pan or a large scale fire. We observe and say, oh yeah, that's out, that's extinguished, or it's 90% extinguished, and it's really not very qualitative. It's qualitative rather than quantitative. And so what we're looking for at this point is some other methodologies, some ways of observing the extinguishment process and doing so in a more efficient manner, maybe using some digital technologies to say when a fire is under control or extinguished. And other performance tests also come into play here, and we want to streamline and come up with methodologies that require more instrumentation and less, let's say, observable technologies. And
Robin, if we're going to save some time for questions, we need to get moving.
I just finished. So
there's one more.
Okay, environmentally friendly propulsion concept. This is something that we've done in the past, and we need to come back every once in a while. We still have some of the same issues. We still use ammonium perchlorate. We still use RDX and isocyanates. And what we're looking for are methods and materials that don't require some of those materials, those toxic or hazardous materials. And again, you look back in time, we've done this a number of times. We're still not there yet. We need to spend some more time looking for advanced propulsion concepts. Over.
All right, Laura. So we would like to close out here by reminding you all that we have our annual symposium. We're not pleased to tell you that it has to be virtual again this year, because I think we missed something when it's not in person, but it is from November the 29th to December the 3rd. Details are on our website, and the URL down there at the bottom of the slide. And then I think now it's time to go on to questions. So Laura, if you would start with the questions, please.
Great. We've received a number of questions, which we'll answer as time permits. But first, we'll focus on those that are generally applicable to all submitters or logistical in nature. So for our first question, can interested parties submit multiple core or limited scope proposals?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yes, they definitely can. We really do not limit people at the number of proposals we want you to address, but certainly you need to determine your workload, of course, and it is a substantial effort to do multiple proposals.
Okay, next question. Are seed projects extendable?
Yes, they are. So both seeds and limited scopes, I describe them as 1 year, $250,000 efforts. The last section of the report, the final report on a seed or a limited scope, we expect to be discussion of opportunities for continued research. So you have an opportunity then to talk about what you've learned, talk about what would make sense to do, and give us a pre-proposal.
All right, next question. What is the typical duration of a standard proposal and the average budget per year?
So that varies widely. So maybe I'm not going to give you the typical, but I'm going to give you the range. Sizes of proposals range from an individual investigator and a graduate student, or an individual investigator and a postdoc. So that may be $150,000, $180,000 a year, up to a multi-laboratory, multi-organization collaboration that could run as high as $600,000 or $700,000 or $800,000 a year. So there's a pretty wide range. The median in there somewhere is something like $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and the median time, I would say, is 3 years.
Okay, this question is for Andrea. Is collaboration suggested in this program? If yes, are there recommended institutions or organizations?
I would not say we explicitly suggest collaboration. We strongly recommend that collaboration, as it meets the technical requirements of your proposal, is encouraged. We certainly have a number of proposals that come in that may be a single investigator with a student, particularly from academic institutions. But we do also get larger proposals that are collaborations between either more than one university or a federal performer or an industrial partner. It really comes down to what makes sense technically for your project or your proposed effort. So having said that, we do not have any recommended institutions or organizations that we would suggest for collaboration. Back to you, Laura.
This question is for Herb. Is there a format requirement for pre-proposals?
Yes, there is. If you go to our website, you will see how to prepare. There's a relatively strict set of topics you have to address, which mirror the selection requirements that I talked about at the beginning of the first 20 minutes of this talk. But so please go find the format. There's also on our management system website, SIMS, which you will find the link to in those instructions. There's a way that you register your proposal, get a system-generated number. All of that has to be on the pre-proposal.
Okay. And another question for Herb. Are there significant differences in the proposal success rate between the different SERDP program areas?
Yes, there are year to year. I will now, I'm making a prediction for the FY23 that we're talking about. I will predict that the success rate for PFAS related projects will be lower than many of the others, because there are so many people around the country that are working in that area. So that is driven by the number of proposals that we get. So it's not, you can't exactly predict it, but definitely the PFAS projects will be tougher to get funding in.
Okay, and this is another general question for Andrea. Will SERDP consider letters or memorandum of understanding from DoD stakeholders or potential customers who might endorse a technology or approach?
Definitely not a requirement, but if you do have letters of endorsement, we do encourage you to include those as an appendix to your proposal. We do look for those, but it is definitely not a requirement. We do get many proposals that do not have letters of support. I would say also that can vary by program area. I immediately spoke from the environmental restoration program area. Some of the other program areas, you know, if a technology does not have direct support with an installation, then it really can't go anywhere if it is going to have difficulty fitting into, for example, the manufacturing process. So it's a little bit on a case-by-case basis as well.
Another general question for Herb. Should the research sites be at any military bases, or does it depend on research need?
Oh, I think that definitely depends on research needs. It would not be, particularly in the more basic end, it would not be usual at all to have the research at a DoD installation unless it was a DoD laboratory. Then, of course, by definition, it is. As the projects mature, late stage SERDP projects may do something at a DoD installation, and certainly when we transition to ESCCP, then that's when those installations will become important.
Okay. A question for Andrea. If a university and national lab wish to submit a proposal as a team, should this be submitted to the BAA or the federal call?
When you have a team that is made up from different types of entities, the decision as far as which call you submit to is dependent on who you decide will be the lead for that proposal. You do need to select one person as the lead. So if the lead person is from the academic institution, it comes through the BAA. If the lead is a federal employee, it comes through the federal call. And the decision, it really doesn't matter in terms of the review of the proposal. So your decision should be based on what makes sense technically for your proposed effort. You keep in mind the lead investigator would generally have as well the overall management of the project in terms of interacting with the SERDP office. And you know, that doesn't suit the skill set of every single person. So you would want to give that some thought as well. Back to you, Laura.
We've also received a number of questions that pertain to specific statements of need. So we'll get to some of those as well. So this question is related to the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area. For the invasive species proposals, do the experimental actions need to be taken, or is it preferred that they take action on DoD lands?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And we received a number of questions kind of on a similar vein. And it really comes down to what Herb had answered earlier, is that if it's, it depends on where it is in the arc of science. On the basic research side, it would be actually fairly unusual for it to be on DoD lands, again, unless it was a DoD laboratory. If once you start getting close to advanced technology demonstration, then there would be the potential that it would be on the DoD lands. Although that's not a requirement. It needs to be relevant to the management of DoD lands, but not necessarily on DoD lands. And real quickly, there was a related question about the use of the term lands in the BAA, in the Statement of Need, whether we only meant terrestrial locations, and were we discounting aquatic environments or marine environments? The answer to that question is no. Lands was being used in a general sense, and we would be open to proposals that were related to aquatic and marine environments, although in every case, the proposal will have to make the case of either on land or at sea, why is it relevant to DoD? Over.
Okay. This is a question for the Weapon Systems and Platforms Refrigerants Statement of Need are measuring the flammability characteristics for the new blend low GWP refrigerants of interest.
Yes, they are. Simple answer. And the methodology for determining inflammability is open. There are methods that are out there, and we're interested in, low flammability, obviously. So yes, measuring is important to us. Over.
Okay. This is a question for the Environmental Restoration Program area. For PFAS impacted sites, should the study be done on DoD sites? Are there specific PFAS to be studied on asphalt and concrete?
I will say that under SERDP, we generally do not require you to go to a DoD site, but in this case, I would say it would be important that these investigations are done at a DoD installation, just to be specific with the sort of materials that contain PFAS that have been used by the military. So yes, that would be a requirement. I'm trying to look at, are there specific PFAS? So if you look at method 1633, there are a number of PFAS that are listed in there, specific analytes. The issue though, of course, with concrete and asphalt is we may not understand all of the degradation products at this point. So some of this will be also trying to understand what some of the products are, but at a first cut, the analytes that are listed in method 1633 is a good place to start. Laura?
For the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area, are you primarily interested in mean sea level as a vertical datum or also in terms of past changes at DoD sites?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So the key element there is the Defense Regional Sea Level Rise database depends on the capability to anchor its data to a reference elevation that is static over a typical infrastructure planning period and consistent across the spatial domain of the project area. So to understand and manage for the potential impacts of future sea level change, the critical prerequisites are the applicability of any particular location is the requirement not only for an authoritative geodesic, in other words, a vertical reference datum, but also a robust estimate of mean sea level that itself can be aligned to the geodatic datum. So we're not as interested in the previous changes in sea level, but into the future sea level changes. Thanks, Laura. Over.
This is a question for the Munitions Response Program area. Can UXO work include ground UXO and partial underwater UXO?
Thanks, Laura. The simple answer is yes. We have to deal with both tidally influenced areas as well as riverine circumstances where there could be flooding and not flooding depending upon time of year and environmental circumstances. So back to my simple answer, yes.
Great. This is a question for Andrea. Can a proposal span multiple statements of need, such as environmental restoration and invasive species?
Sorry. No, you need to pick one. I do understand that sometimes you have a proposal and it truly is relevant to more than one statement of need. You need to pick one. Potentially, if it makes sense, you should consider separating the idea into two different proposals to submit. Laura?
This is a question for the Weapon Systems and Platforms Low GWP Refrigerant Statement of Need. Are you specifically looking into alternative refrigerants used for military vehicles or air conditioners for temporary or permanent buildings, or both?
Permanent buildings, but yes, for trucks and potentially for non-permanent installations as well. Over.
Okay. This is a question for the Resource Conservation Resiliency Program area. Is it possible to propose that some of the work will occur on another federal property where existing work has been ongoing for multiple years but is owned by another agency?
Yeah, sure. Quick answer. Over.
Well, I'll keep it with the RC Statement of Need on invasive species control. Are there specific installations that are the target for specific invasive species, such as feral hogs, that have already been identified by the DoD?
No, what we're really looking, and this is the key element that maybe I overstressed the linkage to the DoD mission. What the key element really, and what's going to get a proposal selected, is the interesting science related to invasive species, and we provide some insight into our invasive species needs by providing a listing. So the key, SERDP is a science program, so it's going to be science driven and needs informed. So the key elements to the science, not necessarily where it's going to be performed. Over.
Okay. This is a more general question for Herb. Are there restrictions on collaborating with companies who may have permanent U.S. residents who are not U.S. citizens? Can a U.S. company collaborate with a Canadian university on a proposal?
So maybe I'll answer that a little. I'll answer the specific question, but I'll also broaden it, because we often get the question of, do we fund universities or research organizations in other countries? And the answer to that, my modified question, is yes, we do. We have a number of both universities and defense research establishments and some companies that are not U.S. based. So the answer to the specific question is yes, you can collaborate with a Canadian company. There are a few technologies, particularly in the weapon systems and platform areas, that may be subject to ITAR. If you don't know what that means, then it probably doesn't apply to you. But if you are working on a technology that is ITAR, maybe ITAR restricted, then that will clearly have to be considered. But in general, most of our projects are what the DoD terms fundamental research, and so results can be shared openly.
This is another question for the invasive species statement of need. Would developing methodologies for detecting and mapping invasive species be acceptable in scope, or do methodologies for control need to be evaluated as well?
Yeah, so great question. And the answer to the question is that the methodologies for detecting and mapping invasive species would be acceptable in scope. And the control methodologies may be evaluated, but that or may not be, whichever it makes sense within the context of the science.
This is a question for Andrea. How many proposals are expected to be funded under the PFAS priorities?
We really don't set those kind of limitations in advance. We fund as many high technical quality proposals as we can that the budget allows. And so as our budget is finalized, that will determine how many proposals we can fund, and it's also balanced with the other program areas, of course. So we really don't determine that in advance. Laura?
This is a question about the PFAS-free foam formulation statement of need. Are you interested in AFFF alternatives?
Yes, we are. Alcohol resistance is one of those, let's say, reach areas where we are interested in that, and it's one of the things that is part of that call. Thank you. Over.
Okay. This is a question for Andrea. For PFAS impacted sites, should recycling and in-place remediation be included in the same proposal, or a proposal can solely focus on recycling and reuse of contaminated materials?
You do not have to include both in the proposal, and if you see the statement of need, it does say that you can address one or more of the objectives. So if you choose to just focus on one of those sub-objectives that's listed, that would be fine. Laura?
A question for the alternate environmentally friendly propulsion concept statement of need. Is plasma-assisted combustion of interest?
Hard to say. I mean, the response is submit the proposal and we'll tell you if we're interested. But I don't know offhand. I don't know the specifics of the proposal, and yeah, just no good answer on that one. Over.
Okay. For the Resource Conservation Resiliency Sea Level Rise Statement of Need, are you primarily interested in future projections of sea level rise and related parameters at DoD sites?
Yeah, so here it's really important for the proposers to look at the public website associated with the Defense Regional Sea Level Rise database to understand our scenario-driven authoritative data approaches to how we're looking at sea level rise into the future. The research is sought that can assist in determining appropriate methods for data acquisition, the identification of minimum standards for data availability, and the quantification of data and data records with acceptable boundaries of uncertainty for this Defense Regional Sea Level Rise application. So it's the key element here is, you know, in CONUS, in continental United States, we have authoritative approaches. Outside, you know, OCONUS is where we need new methods and procedures for approaching the problem of authoritative sea level rise, sea level change information. So I would really strongly recommend that proposers do take a look at the Defense Regional Sea Level Rise database that is public so that they're familiar with our approach. Over.
This question is in regards to the Advanced Coding Statement of Need. Beyond elimination of toxic or hazardous substances in coatings, is there a specific area of interest for coating improvement? For example, is more weight given to ease of application, strippability, lifetime, etc.?
Yeah, I think all of those are so, you know, to specifically answer the question, low toxicity, yes, and ease of use, strippability, life cycle assessment, yes, and yeah, so all of those are important, and we're looking for top coats that can address each and every one of those, or one specific one, and but really do it well. Over.
This is a general question for Andrea. Are examples of previously funded projects in each category available?
There are certainly project descriptions available. We have a description of every project available on our website. And so certainly if you search through there, you can find the projects that would be relevant. They are not necessarily completely called out in a handy set-aside list for you, but they are available on our website. Specifically for PFAS, we included the link on the slides here that will take you directly to a page that lists all the PFAS-related projects. That includes the AFFF alternatives project as well as the PFAS. So that one also would give you PFAS-related projects. Laura?
This is a question about the Resource Conservation Resiliency Statement of Need on Invasive Species. Is that statement of need limited to domestic DoD assets?
No, it's not limited to domestic DoD assets. Over.
Right. And for the development of advanced military coding system statement of need, is it accurate to say that you are interested in top coats only, or could other layers such as pretreatment or primer be under consideration?
Specifically mentioned in the SON is stack ups. So we are interested in the system approach, but top coats was called out as the main concern. So we're interested in both, but top coats have to be part of that. Oh.
For the Resource Conservation Resiliency Sea Level Rise Statement of Need, what are the timescales of future sea level rise projections that you are interested in?
Yeah, so there again, it's important to gain familiarity with the Defense Regional Sea Level Rise Database. The answer to the question is 2100. Yeah, so that's the current answer. Over.
Okay, this is a question for Andrea. Is SERDP interested in both in situ and ex situ improvements in dealing with the minor components?
We are primarily interested in situ improvements. Certainly ex situ would be considered. I was trying to pull up the statement of need while we were talking. I do not believe that we said that ex situ would not be considered, but the strong preference is with in situ.
Okay, and another question for Andrea for the statement of need C2 and C3. Is working at DoD sites a requirement?
We have not made it a requirement. I'm sorry, I was trying to think which ones were C2 and which ones were C3.
I have them in front of me if you want to.
If you could just tell me quickly which they are.
C2 is just the improved management of stormwater impacts, and then C3 is improved understanding of concrete and asphalt impact.
Okay, thank you. As I said before, with the PFAS related ones, we did not specify that it has to be at a DoD site, but it ought to be really to be most relevant. In terms of stormwater, I believe in that one we did discuss specifically the issue is with stormwater that's emanating from DoD installations, so it should be in that case. Laura?
All right, Andrea, this is another question more general about a specific situation. So in a prior year, our proposal, which was submitted by an academic organization, received really good reviews, but it was deemed too expensive due to salaries for personnel and students. Should academics be cautious about including salary on SERDP proposals?
I would say no. You know, certainly we intend that researchers should cover costs for salary and for their students. So if you get a comment back, you know, that it was too expensive, certainly take that into consideration to see if there's a cost saving means that can be implemented. You also may have honestly, for the budget that particular year, it just may not have been doable. But when you have a high cost proposal that you've submitted, it is important to provide a strong rationale for the need for that cost. Typically, as well, if it was cost associated with personnel, I'm going to guess that it was a very large team, which may also have contributed to that comment. Laura?
This is a question for the RC Statement of Need on Invasive Species. Oh, I think we may have answered this. Does the field research itself need to occur on DoD lands, or is it being relevant to DoD lands acceptable?
Yeah, just to replow that furrow a little bit is it needs to be relevant. It doesn't have to be on DoD lands, and the key element is going to be the science that's proposed.
Laura, as I look at the list, it looks like we just about exhausted the questions. Do you agree?
Yes, I'm scrolling around for a couple.
Yeah, I'll give you time to maybe take one or two more.
Right. This is a quick one for Kurt. Is the seed option open for the RC program Statement of Need on Invasive Species this year?
No, it's not, but the limited scope proposal option is. Over.
All right. I'm trying to see if there's another maybe general question we haven't hit from this list.
I think we've gotten all the ones that we normally get, so I'll just do a minute or two to close up here.
All right.
Compared to years past, we actually were able to get to a lot more specific questions than we often have time for. So most people should have gotten their specific questions, you know, how many invasive species, which particular PFAS, those sorts of questions we often don't have time for. But I will remind you that Andrea told you at the beginning of the statements of need that at the bottom of each one is a contact person. So if your particular specific question was not answered, or you think of another one later, please get in touch with the person that's the contact, the program manager for each of the statements of need, and email your question in. With that, I think we'd like to thank you all for attending. Hope that this was useful for everyone, and we look forward to seeing some real good pre-proposals that result from this. Thank you.